Hello, my name is David Bryan, and this is Curiosity Invited, a podcast inspired by endless curiosity. Tune in for an open-minded conversation about interesting and important things. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to Curiosity Invited. This is David Bryan, and today I have the great pleasure of speaking with somebody who I felt like I've known her for a while, but I have not. Her name is I forgot to ask you how to pronounce the middle. So it's Aura Sunada Newlin. I know Aura because she is the executive director of the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center, and we'll talk about what that is in a moment. She is also a speaker, a consultant, a teacher. She has been a professor at Northwest College and is, I believe, still an adjunct at University of Wyoming. No longer an adjunct at University of Wyoming. You became the interim executive director of the center when?
In June of 2022. So I've been in the position for a little over a year now.
Almost exactly a year. I was given that title of you're no longer interim, you're a
just straight up executive director.
Right. Yeah, forever.
And actually for the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation, which is the umbrella organization. The Interpretive Center, which is our museum, is one of the many things that we do.
Okay,
so I'm the executive director
of the Heart Mountain,
or the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation.
Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation. Okay, so so for everybody who, and thank you for being willing to do this and give time, et cetera, and appreciate it. I really actually enjoyed our conversation when I went there. Okay, so why should anybody know what is this Heart Mountain Interpretive Center, the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation? I mean, I know, but make believe I'm dumb. Well, I am. I may be dumb, but.
Well, I am thrilled that you would care enough to ask. The Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation exists to share the story of Japanese American incarceration during World War II, to educate the public about it, to engage new learners about this history, and also to serve as a place for people who are connected to this history personally, serve as a place for, I guess, reconnection and deeper connection as this history relates to our wider society and United States history as a whole. Mm-hmm. So a little bit about how I came to this. I am fourth generation Wyomingite and also fourth generation Japanese American. And I am a descendant of incarcerees who were sent to the camp at Heart Mountain, Wyoming. It was one of 10 effectively concentration camps throughout the United States that the US government, basically set up overnight in the wake of Pearl Harbor at the beginning of the United States entry into World War II. It was determined by the government falsely that in order to protect the national security, they had no choice but to round up everyone with an ounce of Japanese blood from the West Coast of the United States, ultimately more than 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry who were living on the West Coast of the US, round them all up, place them in concentration camps without due process of law, and they were held there through the duration of the war, including my grandmother's family.
And do you either in your role now or before, or it just when it comes up, do you get pushback on the referring to it as a concentration center or concentration camp or incarceration? I mean, I'm a little stunned. I'm stunned when I meet people who have not heard of that slice of history. And I guess a lot of people feel, especially as their hair gets to be more and more this color, maybe a lot of people feel, wait, you don't remember the whatever, or you've never heard of whatever. But and maybe it's just one of those, I was absent that day in class, or yada, 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 whatever that is. But it's stunning to me that the number of people that I've met, many of them, just don't know about that piece. Well, that's not really what, or really, I've never heard of that. And so do you get a lot of pushback on those kinds of, on that terminology?
Oh yeah, for sure. And even I will say, David, that even though you might have missed class on that day, you were not the only one. It is not a well-known history, and that in some ways, I don't know if it was overtly by design, but that is part of what I guess systemic racism looks like in our society. This is a history that was swept under the carpet, has not been really included in history books. And even within the Japanese American community, there was so much shame involved with being incarcerated that our Japanese elders who were incarcerated, on the whole, did not talk about it afterwards. Their approach to dealing with it was to bury it, essentially, and just move on. We're going to put our heads down and just try and make the most of things, make a life for ourselves. And so both the public at large and internally to the Japanese American community, there's a lot that has been lost. And so again, that's part of what the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation does, is to try and reclaim some of that and try and re-educate.
But it is still surprising. It's still surprising to me. And I guess, we're living at a time where there's an effort on both sides, right, left, and all sorts of places, to sort of to cleanse history for the benefit of the possibility of people's feelings, right? That we can't talk about that because we don't want this group to feel badly. We don't want white people to feel badly. We don't want kids to feel badly when they hear about slavery, and all that. The mending of history in those kinds of ways. I feel a little dumb not having realized, oh, wait a second, that's exactly what we're living through. And so why wouldn't it affect this conversation? So, and
absolutely. And your question
please.
about language and terminology speaks directly to that point. So it's really only been within the last few years that I myself have started to feel comfortable using the term concentration camp. It's been a point of contention for years among Japanese Americans and the wider society. But I think increasingly now, especially the younger generations, are moving toward a place where we're being more honest about what these camps were. And especially we're moving away from terminology that was designed to euphemistically soften what they actually were. So the terms that most people would be more comfortable with or more familiar with are things like internment camps, the Japanese American internment, or Japanese American relocation camps.
Relocation is, that's a really good one.
So, and at the time, I mean, Heart Mountain is one of 10 main camps in the country, and it was named the Heart Mountain Relocation Center. But relocation kind of sounds like, oh, we just moved our house.
Wyoming is such a pretty place.
Right. It doesn't really capture that people were taken from their homes, forced out of their homes, allowed to bring only what they could carry in their, suitcases, put on a train to an unknown place, and locked behind barbed wire with guard towers and guns pointing inward at them for an indefinite amount of time with a completely uncertain future.
Well,
simply
because of their ethnicity, right? Simply because of they were Japanese, right? Many of them were American citizens. Right? I mean, they're
about 2/3 of them.
Yeah.
about 2/3 of them were American citizens. About half of them were children. Another sizable portion was, elderly folks. And yeah, it was based on their heritage. And so the government at the time actually referred to these as concentration camps. And the dictionary definition of a concentration camp is what this was. People based on, some identity characteristic were locked away together.
Right.
That's what a concentration camp is. Now, the terminology since World War II has changed in a bit so that when our ears hear concentration camp, we think of the death camps in Nazi Germany. And actually, the term concentration camp for those camps is a little bit euphemistic too. Some of them were, they were concentration camps. People were gathered together on the basis of their ethnicity and imprisoned. But they were also murdered at those. And to call it just a concentration camp is euphemistic for many of them were actually death camps. So in the Japanese American camps, people certainly died over the 3 years that the camps were open, but they weren't places of murder like in Nazi Germany. And so there, for a while, just like you said, there's a lot of sensitivity about we don't want to make people feel uncomfortable. And the word concentration camp makes people feel uncomfortable. Even from Japanese American perspectives, it makes us feel like we don't want to make Jewish people feel uncomfortable by calling it a concentration camp. But that's ultimately all part of this broader narrative of dividing people rather than finding ways of having conversations across differences so that we can really talk honestly about all of our histories and find points of commonality and find parallels, even though the history of the Holocaust is certainly a different history than Japanese American incarceration, but there were parallels.
Sure. Right. Yeah. And I hopefully we'll circle back to that piece, the rising relevance today of having that conversation, those conversations, and this particular slice of American history. And just look at what happened when the pandemic came, and Asian people who looked like they might be Chinese, right, were being assaulted routinely, right? In many cities across the country. So it's not like it's not. Oh, that was back then. That stuff doesn't happen anymore. So yeah. So to be clear, it was only Japanese people from the West Coast, which is another one of those why? You mean the Japanese people from elsewhere were not smart enough to terrorize, right? To do terrible things, right? They were worried about the loyalty of Japanese people on the West Coast, but not anywhere else. Why? So Japanese people elsewhere didn't lose everything and didn't get. They probably got. I don't know that history. Maybe you do, and maybe that's not relevant. But my suspicion is that there were a lot of Japanese people felt uncomfortable during the war and were made to feel even more uncomfortable, regardless of where they lived in the United States. So.
It's absolutely relative. And incidentally, I do know some about that specifically because cool. My family history is abnormal in many ways. In some ways, our incarceration history is similar to many others. But my particular family history, my relatives came straight from Japan to Wyoming, actually, in the early 1900s. Most folks who immigrated from Japan came from Japan to, there were a lot of Japanese immigrants in Hawaii, but a lot of them came to the West Coast, and they were, mostly farmers in California, Washington, and Oregon. But some folks, like my great-grandparents on my mother's side, they came straight to Wyoming in like 1905 or so, and they were recruited here for railroad labor. They were railroaders, they were coal miners, they were laundry workers, and there was a pocket of I think a few hundred Japanese immigrants in Wyoming, and then they started their families here. So most of my great aunts and uncles, my grandparents were born in Wyoming, before the war.
That's wild.
And so on my grandmother's side of the family, her dad, after working for 30 years on the railroad in Wyoming, retired, moved the family to East Hollywood, started a grocery store that incidentally he called the Wyoming Market, and he ran it in East Hollywood, right before Pearl Harbor was bombed. Yep. And so they incidentally got sent back to Wyoming to be imprisoned at Heart Mountain. And that was just, was not by design. That was just their bad luck, I suppose. So that's how they ended up being incarcerated. Meanwhile, my grandfather's family was still living in Wyoming, and Grandpa was working for the railroad himself at the time, and they were not incarcerated. But the Union Pacific Railroad, of its own accord, decided to fire all of its Japanese and Japanese American employees. So my grandpa lost his job. A lot of people lost their homes. They still had to burn and bury their, any of their relics that might connect them to Japan. The FBI came and, investigated my grandpa in Wyoming. So they were affected. They just were not incarcerated. A lot of the folks who were fired from the railroad did lose their homes because they were living in railroad housing.
Sure.
And this was in January of 1942 in Wyoming. So it's really cold and people were getting kicked out of their housing.
Does it make sense to talk a little bit about the experience of being, not you personally, but the experience of being incarcerated at Heart Mountain? I mean, the conditions were that it was not like being thrown into a dungeon, but it was stark and cold. And does it make sense to talk some about that and what some of the restrictions were and all that?
Absolutely.
Because it is such a missing piece of so many people's story. It would be good to at least give a snapshot or two.
Yeah, life at Heart Mountain, as you said, it wasn't a dungeon. In fact, it was a hastily built city that at any given point had about 10,000 people living there, and that made it the third largest city in Wyoming at the time. Definitely, kind of barren and cold and windswept. The sites for these camps were selected on the basis of, is there a large empty space where you could just pop up a town? It had to be near a railroad so people could get there. And they also wanted areas that could be farmed. And so ultimately one of the early hardships of life at Heart Mountain, and ultimately one of the triumphs of life at Heart Mountain, was the farming program, wherein incarcerees transformed the landscape, grew an amazing array of crops, finished digging the irrigation canal that is still in use by farmers today in that area, that had converted it from this kind of barren high plains area into a lush, highly productive farmland. So it was, people lived in barracks that had really no insulation at first. They were crowded. They were surrounded by barbed wire. And again, guard towers with guns pointed inward. People were able to move around freely within the camp. They could, get permission to leave camp. Ultimately, through a really kind of convoluted process, people got permission to leave, not just for work, but to leave and go to college, or to leave and go serve in the military, or even be drafted into the military. But they were not free. every movement they made needed to be like checked through the administration. And so some of the pushback that we get from the folks who remember the warriors locally, and this was kind of fed to people by local newspapers as well, which was like, well, sure, the food in camp was bad, but everybody was experiencing food rationing. Everybody was cold. Nobody had money. At least you guys had like indoor toilets, and at least you were being provided food. How come why are people upset about this? But the distinction of not being free is a powerful one. And the fact that they were being held, indefinitely with no future in sight, not knowing when it would end, and having to give up everything that they had built their lives around before that is an incredibly traumatic and damaging thing to do to people.
Yeah, and you'd mentioned it before, but I mean, maybe my understanding about this is incorrect. But well, so the folks who were incarcerated, taken from their homes, et cetera, on the West Coast, they could bring whatever they could carry, and the rest of their stuff it didn't go into a storage locker someplace. It's gone. It was gone. Their furniture was gone. If they owned the house, it was gone. Yeah.
It depends on the story. Most people lost everything. They had, a matter of weeks or, maybe months between Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was bombed in December, and people started being taken away from their homes in probably March of the following year. But so there was a little bit of time, but people had to get rid of things. They knew that they couldn't take it with them. And so they had to sell things. White people on the coast who were not being incarcerated, on the whole, were taking advantage of people, saying like, oh, I'll give you, a few pennies for your life, the grocery store that you invested your life savings into. Some people put their things in storage, and a lot of those storage areas were looted. They had maybe neighbors or other friends taking care of them, but then people just stole it. And so on the whole, most people lost everything. But one of the amazing, I'm going to go off on a little tangent here.
Go for it.
But one of the stories that we are currently telling at Heart Mountain, we have a special exhibit space, and this temporary exhibit is just going up like this week. It'll open at Heart Mountain. And it's showcasing a neighborhood called J Flats in it's actually south of East Hollywood, or part of East Hollywood in Los Angeles, an area that's now known as Dayton Heights, or Virgil Village. And in that particular neighborhood, almost everybody, it was a heavily Japanese American neighborhood, and almost everybody ended up at Heart Mountain. But unlike a lot of other folks in other neighborhoods, the people in this neighborhood didn't lose all of their things, largely because there was a Black family who lived there and had befriended all of their Japanese American neighbors. And when the Japanese Americans were rounded up and sent to camp, this family looked after their things, and even went so far as to like drive to the temporary assembly center where their friends were like held in horse stalls and at racetracks, bringing them food and passing food through the barbed wire, as a way of sort of caring for their friends in the way that they were able to. So it's this beautiful story of cross-racial allyship and solidarity in a really, just individual, personal way. So there were a lot of angels like that who helped people.
Wow. Yeah, I'm hemming and hawing here because I'm actually choking up. It's such an amazing thing that went on. It's almost, I don't understand why I'm about to use the word, right? It's almost unimaginable, and I don't know why I believe that. or I don't believe it. I don't know why I'm saying that, because it's so imaginable. We know that, our U.S. history is littered with those sorts of, whether it was the Irish or the Jewish people or the Black people, or right, there are so many specific injustices that have gone on.
It's appalling.
Yeah, it's everybody. Like it can happen to everybody. It can happen to everybody or everybody's relatives, and in many cases it has. I mean, my grandparents were here. I'm Jewish. My grandparents are here to get away from, in one case it was to get away from the pogroms in Latvia and Lithuania, and right. I mean, another case it was to get away from the sort of the troubling rising, the rise of Nazism and fascism and anti-Semitism, and those were stories in my upbringing, but they weren't me, but they were stories, and it's so sprinkled throughout an American past, and I'm certainly guilty of this. Is, we're almost encouraged not to think of roots, right? Not to think of our roots, and maybe it's different in your family. I don't know, but nobody did that to me, and my grandparents survived, so not all my relatives survived, but so it's almost like a movie. It's not my movie. It's a moving movie, but it's not, and yet it is.
And yet it is. And one of the things that I'm coming to realize myself, and that I think the wider Japanese American community is coming to realize, and maybe maybe Jewish Americans as well, is that it is like, actually, this does still live in me. And now that I know what it looks like, it occurs to me that I personally am still incredibly affected by this. So I was raised a couple of layers of separation from it. I mean, it was very common for Japanese Americans to not talk about their experience after they were released. In general, the younger generations were meant to feel like, we're just very grateful for everything that we have, and we're not going to dwell on the bad things, right? And in my case, certainly I have, like you, I'm like, well, it wasn't me that was incarcerated. And in fact, it wasn't even my grandmother or my grandfather who were incarcerated. It was my grandmother's family at Heart Mountain, but she herself, kind of slipped through the cracks and got out of California just in time. She still had to evacuate. She was still removed, but she didn't end up being incarcerated because she just kind of got lucky and had an opportunity to leave. But all of her siblings and her parents were at Heart Mountain. And I think that created a rift in our family with her feeling like she didn't suffer as much as her siblings and parents, and therefore there was probably some guilt associated there. And so I distinctly remember always growing up like, well, I'm fine. And, it wasn't my grandmother who was incarcerated. So it's really like telling somebody else's story. But now I see it differently. I see that my grandmother did suffer incredibly, even though she wasn't put in camp. She still experienced that, racial exclusion. And the way that those generations parented their children, and the way that their children parented their children, my generation, was such that, for example, the way that we're learning a lot about multi-generational trauma now, that's sort of the word for it, intergenerational trauma or multi-generational trauma. And the way that this manifests in me, and incidentally in a lot of Japanese Americans my age, is that we're a little bit too rosy. Like for me, I'm always like, I'm fine. Isn't things great? I have an easy time projecting exuberance. I have a difficult time expressing negative emotion. And I can see that passed down from my grandparents and their parents ultimately be like, don't complain, don't let on that you're hurting. And so I've embodied that. I also feel guilty all the time about everything. Like even the smallest of things, I've realized that pretty much if you present me with a situation, my first experience emotionally is guilt. Like, oh, I should be doing something other than what I'm doing. And that's actually one of, these symptoms. And there are several of those things that I thought were just like sort of strange about me. But they're actually common in my generation of Japanese Americans. And as I've had conversations with people in other, minority groups, they've said similar things, different manifestations in their own lives. But if I could turn the questioning a little bit in the other direction, David, I'm kind of curious about if you heard, like, what kind of messages do you feel like were given to you as a descendant of people who had to flee Nazi Germany?
Well, I remember specifically. I mean, it was not to be passive in the face of injustice, because it can happen again. And but I will say, and this just maybe my family and not necessarily the, sort of in the Jewish community. One of my grandfathers fought in World War I, and my father, my uncles, in fact, my mom was a Marine during World War II, and my dad, his brother, my mom's brother, et cetera, were all, in fighting the war in World War II. And I guess they had all experienced discrimination in various ways. And so there was an ethos of circle the wagons and be on guard. Right. And I think that from my point of view, I remember specifically in my family having numerous loud conversations around various collections of relatives, sort of being told, I need not to like Arabs. It's important that I hate Arabs because they hate me. And, me pushing back is like, well, I don't really know any Arabs, and how do you know they hate me, and yada, yada, yada. So there was the questioning of the value of painting any group with one particular color, with one particular paintbrush. But that, and I don't know, maybe it's growing up a guy, in the circumstances I grew up, but you walk into a situation and you assess the danger level always. So that just may be growing up in the United States of America as a guy, and fighting was more prevalent back then than I think it is now. Not like it's gone, but so there was always an assessment of like, what do I have to be wary of right here? And I grew up, we moved around a lot as a kid, and I grew up in some areas that were mostly Jewish, and in other areas where, I didn't know it until I discovered it, where we were the only Jewish family around, and everybody else knew it, except I didn't know that. I didn't until everybody was like, somebody said Jewish, and a whole room full of people turned and looked at me like, the hell do they know what I am? They know. So there is that sort of paranoia. But that just may be me. I just may be paranoid. So
you may be paranoid, but I think this is also what is what is done to us by our society. And it's internally, this is done to us by our families who are trying to protect us from harm. It's also done to us by our government, who is telling us to, who is a good citizen and who is not, who is
Right.
a loyal citizen and who is not. And so we take in all of these messages, and that over time has served to kind of divide us. And so what I find really personally enriching, like one of the most enriching things in my life that I seek out, is to have cross-racial, especially cross-racial conversations, and really get to know and love people who have a different background than I do, because it enriches my life. Like it's fun for me, and it makes me a better person, and I seek out conversations across differences. Whereas I think a lot of the messages that we get from wider society is that we need to kind of stick within our own group, whether for protection or for betterment of whatever.
Yeah.
But I find that to be kind of toxic and uninteresting. And so by extension, that's part of what we're doing at Heart Mountain as well, which I think is maybe what you were just going for.
Well, I'm going to get back there, but I'm curious now. So, recently and then, well, very recently it was repeated, and way back when Roberts, Chief Justice, that is, the decision about, sort of weakening the Voters Act. Essentially, the message was, if you want to stop discrimination by race, you stop discrimination by race. And that's sort of simplistic. We're not going to look at that. I mean, it's not okay to look at those things. It's not okay to assess. Affirmative action is struck down because of, we're discriminating by race. So is it best to homogenize, or is it best to celebrate, embrace diversity? My personal opinion, and I think yours, is the latter. People have rich, textured lives personally and historically, and whoopee, that makes it good. It's like, it's a stew with lots of ingredients. It's not just salt. It's not just pepper. It's a lot of different flavors. And isn't that wonderful? But I imagine, well, I'm fantasizing, right? I imagine there are people who feel like, well, why is it important to remember this this particular blemish on American history, and what happened to the Japanese, and so I'm not sure that's a question. It's but here we are. But
here we are, and I would add to that it's a matter of celebrating our differences, but also being unafraid to engage with the pain. And I say this as somebody who, admittedly, I'm not very good with engaging directly with pain. Like, I've been raised to avoid conflict, which again is a very Japanese American thing. But having lived a life where I have mostly thought it was a good thing to be kind of a chameleon and to fit in wherever, like I can have a conversation with anybody, which has served me really well. But I think it also involved a lot of hiding. I'm mixed race. And so I can pass as white. I can pass like I'm ambiguously ethnic. And I've always seen that as an asset. But ultimately, I've also come to realize that it's also been a very closeted existence. I tend not to, until, the last few years, I tend not to put my real self out there, maybe as a protection mechanism for me, or I feel like, people don't want to know about the hard stuff. And it's considered rude to ask other people about things that are painful. But actually, that's what is real. So if we don't engage directly with things that are both beautiful, but also things that are painful, then we don't get to really know each other at a deep and real level. Our relationships remain at a surface level, and ultimately, I've decided that that's not really the life that I want to lead for myself. So
I understand that.
Bring on the ugly along with the beauty.
Well, you sort of turn yourself there. So, and what else does the Heart Mountain Foundation do? What else is under your umbrella?
Let me tell you what else is under our umbrella. I mean, the museum is the centerpiece of what we do. But we also are sort of caregivers of the historic site. So we have a number of, there are just a handful of original buildings left from the camp that are still there. And we look after that. So it's some historic preservation work, with the idea that if we can preserve these physical structures, then that provides us with another way of connecting with people and helping people learn from our history. We have a really major part of what we do that is education and outreach. So we bring people to our museum as a way of teaching, but we also do a lot of public-facing work. Our board of directors is extremely active, doing, public speaking all over the country, all over the world, in fact. And we, for example, for the last 3 years have hosted teacher workshops at our site funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Oh, wow.
And we bring groups of junior high and high school teachers from all over the country to our site for a week at a time to give like an intensive educational retreat. And then, having experienced that themselves, they develop lessons plans and take them back to their classrooms all over the country and help to educate, current generations of students about this history. So there's a lot of, bringing people to us, but also spreading things out. And then that ties into, it's all part of the newest initiative that we're working on. We're actually building a physical expansion to our museum that we're calling the Menedes Simpson Institute at Heart Mountain. And that reflects, an expansion of our physical footprint on the ground, but also a broadening of what we aspire to do, which is to really invite people in to have conversations just like the one that you and I are having right now, about real things that matter to real people now. The name, the Menedes Simpson Institute at Heart Mountain, is in honor of and in the spirit of our honorary advisors, Senator Alan Simpson, Republican from Wyoming, and Secretary Norman Mineta, Democrat from California. And they have been with us from the start of the foundation. They are really kind of the heart and soul of who we are, and we've built ourselves as a foundation in their image. We just lost Norm last year, so we're still really in mourning from his passing. But these two men, if I can divert a little bit and tell you the story of these two men, because absolutely. They are amazing. Yeah. They met as children when Norm, at 11 years old or something, was incarcerated at Heart Mountain. And Al Simpson was living in Cody, the neighboring town. And while there was all of this fear and kind of animosity from the local community toward the camp, again, largely because of the media, the Boy Scout troop leaders, there was a Boy Scout troop at Heart Mountain within the camp. And he put his head together with a Boy Scout troop in Cody, and they arranged to have a jamboree. And the Boy Scouts from Cody came out to Heart Mountain and spent a couple days in the camp, and they paired up. So Al and also his brother Pete, both of these men are just two of the most beloved men in Wyoming. both of them came out as Boy Scouts, and Al happened to be paired up with young Norm Mineta, and they shared a tent together, and they, did all their kind of hooliganism, and they
did all the things they weren't
played
supposed to do
pranks,
together.
and they were like little boys having fun playing Boy Scouts together. And they realized that even though they look differently and they live on different sides of the fence, boy, did they have a lot in common, and boy, could they have fun together. So they went on their ways. And then as adults, they both joined the US Congress right around the same time. Again, with Al as a Republican and Norm as a Democrat. And they remembered that friendship from when they were kids. And that friendship really just grew and grew to be the deepest kind of love that you can have for another human being. Throughout their careers in Congress, they became known for working together in a bipartisan fashion, whatever ways they could. Their politics were different, and they weren't sacrificing who they were, but they valued each other so much, and they valued this idea of democracy so much that they could come together and work on things of great importance. Each of these two men were awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by a president of the opposite party. And so their whole lives and careers exemplified this idea that it's more important to be able to connect with each other and see each other's humanity than to kind of focus on the things that divide us, be it politics or race or whatever. And so to come back to what we're building at Heart Mountain, the Menedes Simpson Institute at Heart Mountain is designed to kind of channel their spirit and tap into this power of place that we have at Heart Mountain. If you come to our site, it feels different. Like you can go to a museum, in Washington, D.C. or along the coast or something that talks about this history, but to come to our site, there's something palpable that is different. So what we aim to do is to tap into that power of place, invite folks from all over the country, be they political leaders or educators or, corporate leaders, people across the professions, children, really deliberately invite people to have conversations at our site across differences. So I cannot wait for the day that will be pretty soon, I think, where we'll be able to invite like Democrats and Republicans in the state legislature or in the National Congress to come together to our site to reflect on these big questions that plague our society: race, immigration, national security, civil liberties, and be able to sort of try to set aside the partisanship or the things that we cling so tightly to keep us separate. If we can kind of soften people's defenses, then we like to see ourselves as building kind of a new model, a new way of having our country work.
That's wonderful.
So it expands it beyond Japanese American incarceration history, I guess is what I'm saying. Yeah. There are lessons that are beyond, 1942 to 1945 right. Japanese Americans.
Lessons larger than Japanese, lessons larger than race, lessons larger than ethnicity, than any of those things. Right. So yeah, wonderful. I mean, that is we all know that is so deeply needed. Everybody's, reaching for that brass ring. And there probably are many brass rings to be grabbed from a lot of different perspectives, but this certainly sounds like one of them. So
you came to Heart Mountain for the first time, a few months ago. Were there other things that struck you about our site?
Yeah, so one of the things was, I think you are correct. There is something, there are places where you go, where one goes, where you start whispering. For me, it's like, so you go to the Lincoln Memorial and you walk in, and it's not true. It's not every memorial, but the Lincoln Memorial, there is something about how that was built, and you just start to whisper, right? Or, you walk into the Supreme Court building and despite the stupidity that sometimes came out of those walls, it is wow, right? Or and that was the experience I had there. Was like, oh, this is really the place. This is the place, not the only place, obviously, where that happened. So that's something. I think the displays were really intelligent. It was different display the several times that I've been there, different displays, and they were really well done, both clear and thorough. I was, in terms of the particular pieces of information, I had no idea that Japanese Americans were allowed to enlist, were drafted, and I learned afterwards that, and maybe there's just a historical hiccup or one of those, I wonder why, that Heart Mountain was, the population at Heart Mountain was much more organized about draft resistance, in principal draft resistance by the Japanese Americans than other places. So I thought a lot of that, I wish that had when I was learning about all those things and there were juicy conversations to be had, I wish that had been a topic. Like, what, why is that? And what do you mean? What do you mean you could go fight in the war as, like, wait, you can't trust me to be on the street, but you're going to give me a gun and I get to go? What? So, a lot of those things. And I think we got here in the winter. We moved here in the winter. It's damn cold in the winter. And they weren't even looking at the sort of the facsimiles of the living spaces. We're like, oh, and come to learn really from you last time. And it's like, what you all built is much nicer than what people were living in. And, the big gaps, you go into the museum and those big gaps, the gaps when the wood, between the wood planks, when they shrink inside the museum, you can't feel the wind. But boy, the wind in Wyoming in the winter, and especially across a big open space like that, it was cold. It was harsh. That was a harsh place to be. Forgetting that you're locked up, there's barbed wire, there are guards, you didn't do anything wrong. And then on top of that, damn, it's cold. And so that, I was before when we were speaking, I was deeply moved. I was moved to tears several times walking through the museum. So I guess that's maybe more of an answer than you wanted.
That was exactly what I was wanting. Thank you, David. And again, thank you for allowing yourself, consciously or unconsciously, to be moved, because it is a moving place. I remembered one thing as you were talking that I wanted to add, which is about again, this power of place that we have. And one of the new initiatives that we're just rolling out this year for the first time, which is to bring people to our site in all of its dimensions. So we have the museum, which, as you said, is magnificently done. It's a world-class museum. And the exhibits have a lot of information, really designed for people who might not know anything about this history. And it's really intellectually stimulating, I think. One of the things that we're building outside of the museum, I had mentioned the historic preservation aspect of our site, and there are, a couple of places. We have a military honor roll. We have some of the original hospital buildings. We have a root cellar. We have one of the original barracks that we've moved back to our site, and we're restoring it. But when you get out of the museum and you can like feel how windy it is, and you can, smell the sagebrush, and you can see the landscape, and you can see this mountain on the horizon, there's a different kind of learning that happens. And one of the things that I am most proud of in the year that I've been executive director so far is the work that I've done to start telling not just Japanese American histories at this site, but also Indigenous histories at this site. So before my relatives were forcibly moved to Heart Mountain, Indigenous peoples were forcibly removed from it. Most notably the Absaluke people, or more commonly known as the Crow people. Still need to get it off of my tongue properly. But I have a good coach who I have brought onto my staff as a full-time employee. His name is Johnny Tim Yellowtail. He's a member of the Absaluka Nation. And his role on our team is as historic site caretaker. And so within that, we think of it as caring for the physical aspects of the site, which can be like removing tumbleweed from around the barracks so that it doesn't, it's not such a fire hazard, sort of groundskeeping and caring for the physical site, but also caring for the spiritual dimensions of the site, because this really is a sacred place for a lot of Japanese Americans. It's a place where we feel like we should whisper, right? When we go there, that's this sacredness that is really important to Japanese Americans. It's also a sacred site for the Indigenous peoples who have called that place home, particularly the mountain. And so by bringing Johnny Tim Yellowtail onto our team, he cares for the physical site, but he also, does a daily blessing when he raises the flag up on the hill every morning by the military honor roll. And he sings, and he cares for the site in a way that makes sense to him from the culture that he inherited from his ancestors. And so he has also started to lead guided tours of the site beyond the museum. And in those guided tours, he obviously talks about Japanese American history, but in addition, he talks about his people's history and their stories that connect them to this place. And he'll sing and he'll drum. He's an award-winning powwow dancer, a champion powwow dancer who's traveled all over the world representing, his culture. And so he shares that with our visitors. And in that way, the feedback that we've gotten so far, it's a very new program, but the feedback that we've gotten is that approach helps people feel, the learning happens in their heart through what he offers. Whereas our museum, it helps people connect through the head, right? Like, oh my gosh, that just blew my mind. I had no idea that people were not only allowed to serve, but they were drafted while they were in camp. Like, that blows the mind, right? What Johnny Tim does outside of the museum on the site, people say that it connects them through their heart. And it makes the tears flow easier than they would otherwise. And ultimately that's, something that brings healing. And so I'm personally very excited about that new dimension. My aim is for local folks and Wyoming folks in general to feel like this is really a part of Wyoming history. It's not a part of Japanese American history. It's a part of American history, and it's an important part of Wyoming history. And for people to feel a sense of ownership and a sense of belonging and a sense of welcome, that's what we're aiming for. Because again, to cycle back, I'm trying to get us away from this idea that, oh, because that didn't happen to me or to, my people, I'm not allowed to really ask questions, or it's not really my business. I want people to say, like, yes, it is my business, because we're all, we're Americans and we're humans, and this is a really important human story to tell.
Completely agree. And so Aura Sunada Newlin, it's lovely to see you again. And thank you for being willing to do this. And I hope there's a next time. So
yes,
whether it's this way or face to face. So
very good. Thank you so much, David.
You're welcome. So now